How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Julian Gonzalez here. And today, let's take a look at the second model of the CSS for JavaScript developers, which is a course taught by, Josh Comewa, a software engineer that has previously worked at companies like Khan Academy and Gatsby, which is a CMS, right, content management systems, all of them built in React. And because the idea of this particular course is to describe what is CSS and be effective with being effective in doing so. Okay, so first on the model 0 we went through describing what is CSS. All right, so from the MDN docs, so what is CSS, how you can add styles to your CSS, whether it is internal or external style sheets or inline, how you can now select elements into the DOM via tags or class or attributes, or any of these state-based selectors such as pseudo classes and pseudo elements, and also how you can cherry pick elements via combinators, okay, whether it's a direct child or a next sibling, so on and so forth. In the property shorthands, as well as the other part of the anatomy of CSS, functions, add rules. So functions are for example, these utility functions like mat, like calc, translate, RGB, cramp, HSL, you name it, and the add rules, which is how you can describe now how CSS actually behave or should behave, as well as the comment. And then we look at the most specific yet relevant tools that we need to know in the CSS as a way to develop completely the notion in 2025 what is the fundamental of CSS, and that is the ability to describe a rule, what is a media query, why media query is still helpful, some specific CSS selectors that are still relevant despite that you have all of these Moto.js tool that automatically generate all of these selectors for us in a way that is maintainable, which is giving a particular scope or a hash. Again, despite that, we need to still know this nifty pseudo selectors like hover, focus. And why focus is important? Because this is something that is heavily used by web assistant technologies and also part of the web standards, the WCAG 2.1, the web content accessibility guidelines. All right, it follows 4 principles that must be perceivable, it must be operable, is understandable, and is robust. So focus enters here into this realm. Another selectors, this is pseudo classes like check and first and last end type, first and last child, first and last end type, and how this is useful, especially when you want us to actually match that particular pattern. Okay, and also the other is the way of how can we now is or the pseudo element as well. All right, so these particular selectors are still quite useful, especially for decoration, like after and before, as well as the placeholders. and some of the combinators, all right, for example, like the send child, uh, the color, the different color formats, the unit, the most common unit format or units, whether it is m, root m, and percentage, and why, uh, what is each one of them, and also the typography. So, for example, font family. What is a font family? Which is this multiple character set that, for example, fonts like Roboto has 6 different font weight and 2 formatting. It's normal and italic. And how? Because all of this is something that is provided by default from the OS to the to the browser, and you can have access to, for example, like Times New Roman and Tahoma and so on and so forth. Because applications developers and venture capitalists and people that actually wants to build a product, they say, hey, you know what, well, we want to now give a unique experience for that. So because of this unique experience that they want to give, now we have this thing called web font, which is this custom built-in, sometimes in-house development that in the case of Airbnb they're using now this Cyrillian font, all right, Cyrillian font, sorry, and with that we also looked at, for example, you can download all of these particular fonts, whether it's on Google APIs, and understand now the different text formatting or the most relevant from that, which is, hey, bold to indicate that this is important, italic because in-person communications has a lot of this non-verbal clues, all right? So as a way to describe that is, for example, italic is being used to describe a TV or book, you use italic, or when a character is thinking that, you use italic, or when you try to use some scientific phrases or foreign language, you use now italic, or if you want to quote something, you use italic as well. All of this is just this different use case in which we use now this italic fonts, and this is quite interesting as we now develop our intuition of how all of this is all about. Now, the other is the text underline, which is very specific for the web, okay, as well as the text alignment, text formatting, which is mentioned, text alignment, text spacings, and text transformation. So all of these things that I mentioned before, all right, is just the foundations at the current state of the 2025 in CSS that you need to know, okay, that'll give you now, that'll make you more effective. So that's why we look now at the rendering logic, which is again is going into deep stuff, and understand that because browsers now come out with this particularly built-in styles for certain elements, and because in the early days each one of those vendors provide their own built-in the declarations, okay, on how their elements should look like. And because of that, if you can imagine that you're going to develop an application in that landscape, that you say, oh my god, so I need to somehow bring some sort of normalizations or some sort of standard here. And this is when we look at these CSS resets, which is made by Eric Meyer, the CSS, back in 2007 and then in 2011. Okay, so these are something that are back then focused on what are the most problematic stuff across browsers where we need to have a blank state, right? We need to have a common ground. So all of them involved is padding, margin, box size. It's something that we're going to describe, the box size, as well as the alignment and the spacing. But because now in 2025 most of browsers actually now faithfully follow the CSS spec, so thanks for that. There's still some specific nuance that you want to override or you want to now is provide a common ground. So another disclaimer here is CSS reset, you shouldn't use that if you already have an existing code base, because perhaps if you add that to your code base, your user wouldn't know, you as a developer wouldn't notice, but the users will. So if you follow this road, then you make sure that have and run extensive testing to guarantee that experience that your users always has. So yeah, basically is that. A now well understanding is another important topic here, which is the inheritance, which the way of how can we now pass values, or in other words, the way how can we now access value from parent to child. And there are some specific properties that we inherit that most of the times are in text fonts or in the typography. You can think of this as in JavaScript as the prototype opportunity, all right, where you're going to now look up at that particular property through the prototype change, and if that exists, good, and if it's not, well, good luck. You're gonna use is whatever you have at the top, all right. So you can also force inheritance, okay, by actually using is the inherit for that, or to override some of their behaviors. But the TLDR of this is for forcing inheriting or understand the inheritance, all right, that most properties that you can inherit are typography related. So text font, so font size, text shadows, and so on and so forth, as well as color is another one, right? Width is another one. You can inherit that. Is that you can inherit those properties. So for example, most of the times are font size or typography, all right? Most of the time are typography. Then in typography that include is font size, line styles, the text alignment, text spacings, transformations. So all of these are things that are inherent, all right? And they are not included in the list above. There are also a number of speech-related CSS property that are inheriting as well. But again, the point of this is the kind of font or the kind of properties that we can inherit. So again, because the people who wrote CSS spec says that, or they see that it's quite convenient to let some particular property that allows to inherit their values, all right? So we don't have to override them. Typography is one of them. So here we look now at this particular example here, right? So missing short hence values, and inheriting using CSS shorthand, right? This is a good example of how you can use. You have to specify that. Now, then we look at, this is the built-in declarations and inheritance, part of the core of the rendering logic. And then we look at the cascade style, which the cascade is the way how CSS resolve competing CSS declaration. That's the entire reason of the cascade, all right? And how in the cascade, that even though that we don't go any further, okay? So the cascade style is this how browsers resolve competing CSS style. Joshua say that it's not quite relevant to know this, at least not at the current state, but I will say that master, teacher, I'm sorry, but this is relevant. If you truly want to know what is this and how specific things are computed and calculated, it is important at least to know the basic. And then if you want and if you need to dive deep into this, good. So yes, I did. And to summarize this, which is from the Amelia Wattenberg blog, a research engineering at GitLab that report directly to the CTO team. She said, hey, this cascade stuff here is important to understand because at least from the high level perspective, we can know what it's all about. And if we do, it'll make a lot of sense now how things work behind the scenes. The TLDR is that it follows several tiers in this cascade. So the first is the importance, where it's going to look at things like transition or the important tag or animations, as well as the normal values. And if that doesn't, so the further it falls that, all right, the further this competing CSS styles, CSS rule, or CSS styles, or CSS declarations, which is important. The further the CSS declarations falls into the cascade, the less likely are they going to be in the end style. So this is the important, and then we look at the origin. Is this written from the website or from the user or from the browser, all right? The other is, is this now based on the specificity of the selector, all right? So whether it's if you're using inline style or interesting inline style or layer, which is an add rule, right? So you define the behavior of how CSS should behave, the layer, and then if this is an ID, or if this is a class, attribute, or a pseudo class, or if this is now a tag or a pseudo element, right? And if it fall into the last position, all right, which is the order in which declaration was defined, so the later or the latest is gonna take it, all right. The latest is gonna take it. So again, but the point of this is to describe this cascade style and how these things actually works. And the further you fall into the cascade, the less likely are to be on the final CSS. And in this cascade, that it begins with the importance, and then it's going to look at the origin, where it was defined, and then at the specificity, all right? What is the specificity of this particular selector? And then now the order in which this rule was defined. right? So that was quite interesting, I must admit, to understand, all right? And what are the similarities with this cascade model have with the I put it that way. Hmm. Yeah, the similarities must be here. Exactly, the similarities with GSS, which is pretty much like when you're using now a spread in an object. So the further is this style declaration, uh, uh, the more likely it will be applied, right? Uh, but again, this is on competing. This might not be the competing inherit style, tag style, class styles, ID style, inline style, and important style. So you can think of this as this set of declarations, object that we are merging, that has now all of these different levels of how you're going to spread, and the last has now a particularly it gonna end up into the final object. Okay, so the order here is that is in reverse order, because the cascade, according to the Amelia Wattenberger, is describing is the further it falls into cascade, the less likely is to appear in the object or in the final style. So when you apply now this CSS style to the spread operator, the order is reversed, right? So or in this case, the further the 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 further on the top, or the closer on the top of the cascade is, the more likely it will be appear. So in other words, it will be at the end of the JavaScript object. In any case, so then in the relevance in modern applications, it says that if you have now convoluted CSS selectors, that's an indicator that you must simplify things, because especially in this React component or any component development, you should not, I repeat, you should not use this in a way that impact your readability. This is not actually used, because all of these CSS selectors are now, if you're using is React, for example, in Vue, behind the scenes, they now offer toolings for defining those styles that you're applying to that component scope. Okay, and that's something interesting, and that's why they don't, here in the model development, we don't dive deep into the cascading style, because it's quite irrelevant. But if you go up and beyond of that, you will see that not only that this is that the world of the web is based on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and it's important for you to understand how all of these things works. Now, on that, we look at the directions of the text, all right, and the block and the inline direction. And I think this is quite interesting, because the case that I want to present here is to say, this is how we read now words in English, and even in Spanish, all right, in any Latin language, where you go from left to right, all right, to read word by word, all right, in a paragraph that goes from top to down, all right. So top to down now is known as the block axis, or the main axis, and the word by word, the inline axis, is going to the is this particular axis, or the inline axis. So with that reference, imagine that you need to, for example, apply some margins to left to an Arabic language, right? where now they're starting from right to left, all right? Or imagine that you now have this hand style typography, such as the vertical one, you know, that you're gonna read now is in this particular order, right? So all of this is just to say so all of this is just to say the following. All right. All of this is to say the following. How can we now make sure that any time that we read a specific text, we have at least some mental model where we know how to align our documents, the direction of where this content is going to be filled. Okay, so a lot of this terminology comes from the print media, and there is something known as the logical properties as a way to promote is this particular properties when it comes to margin and padding. And I will say, let me actually explore this. Logical operators in MDN, okay? Expressions and operator, right? Logical, but in CSS, the logical operators, logical properties, sorry, that's sorry. So logical properties and values. The CSS logical property and values model defines logical property and values that can be controlled layout that can be controlled logical property and values that can control layout through logical rather than physical directions. So these logical properties are defined as values that can control you the layout through the control the layout through logical rather than physical properties. This physical property is the margin and the so the margin, for example, and padding. Logical property define direction relative equivalence to their corresponding physical properties. The start of a line is not always on the left side of a line. Different writing systems operate in various directions. So for example, English and Portuguese are written from left to right. All right. Hebrew and Arabic from right to left. You may wonder why this is important. Oh, because here we go with the power dynamic. In any case, in some writings, the text lines are vertical. All right, like the hand case for that. Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese are traditionally written vertically from top to bottom, with each new vertical line added to the left on the previous one. Traditional Mongolian is also a top to bottom language, but new lines are to the right of the previous one. But as you can see here, is this. So rather than using it, so the logical property and values use the abstract term block and in line to describe the direction in which they flow. The physical meaning of this depends on the writing mode. Block direction and inline direction. This is the reason why we're looking at the direction. So block direction is perpendicular to the flow of the text within a line, perpendicular to the flow of the text, perpendicular to the flow of the text in that. So in other words, this block from left to right is perpendicular to the flow of text to that. In Arabic language, in Arabic or Hebrew language, right? In your case, is that. In my case, it's from Spanish, English, or Spanish or Portuguese or English, right? Where now, from your perspective, this block line is perpendicular to the flow of text. Alright, so how you gonna read this text? Depending of how you read that, and if that is so the perpendicular means is the block direction, and they don't mention anything about main axis, inline axis. I think that the web now is starting to refine their own terminology here. But this is the block dimension. All right. So for standard English, is the vertical dimension. All right. And the inline dimension is parallel to the flow of the text. All right. So in other words, in whether it's inline or whether it's right to left or left to right is this. But if you have now in alphabet like Japanese, Korean, they now this. So actually is the inline direction is something that is vertical. All right, the vertical is this. Again, all of this is to develop the notion to understand is how do we get here and why we're actually looking at this specific content. Okay, again, according to Josh Comewa. All right, the first thing first is to look at the built-in and the rendering logic. We're just going to look now at the built-in directive as well as the inheritance, the cascade styles, and how with the cascade style, the cascade style, all right, and now the block direction and the inline direction and how those describe that. And now we're starting to understand why this directions, okay, is something that is in combination with the internationalization API that allow you to, for example, is getting a particularly collateral or language alphabet. All right, it is useful for sorting or comparing words in that particular alphabet, right? So the idea here is to see how CSS and JavaScript actually both are related, okay? That I think that is very, very beautiful how they do that. So let's keep going. The other is the box model. All right, here we go. The box model, the most common CSS related job interview question is probably this: can you explain the box model? Let me do this because I want to know the knowledge gap here. Okay. The box model. Exactly, the box model. A typical interview question is: can you explain to me, can you explain the box model? All right. in italic. Can you explain the box model? Okay. So is the way how CSS organize HTML elements into, yeah, is the way how CSS organize HTML elements to be rendered on the screen. Let's go to now dive deep into this, shall we? So if we say this is the way how CSS organize HTMLs to be rendering on the screen, I don't think that this is quite adequate or quite, because all the things we can say is this is the way how CSS organize CS. This is the way how CSS. This is the way. This is the way CSS describe HTML elements, describe visually how HTML elements describe visually, because it's that. So is the way CSS describes visually HTML elements. Okay. To apply certain rules is the way CSS describe visually HTML elements. Okay. Is the way CSS describe visually HTML elements. Or is the way CSS represent, because it's that, is the way how CSS represents visually HTML, represents visually HTML elements to apply is a way CSS represents visually HTML elements. Okay, so it is the CSS version of what a closure is. In the way CSS represents visually HTML elements. Okay, it is the way CSS represents visually HTML. We can even ask law here a little bit. As a rectangle. But I can say is a way CSS represents visually HTML elements as a rectangle. So a CSS version of what is a closure. It is a CSS version of what is a closure. So it is the CSS version of what is a closure. Or what's the difference between classic and prototypal inheritance? Or what's the difference classical and prototypal inheritance? Interesting that what is using this. It is a CSS version of what is a closure. Of what is a closure. Or what's the difference of classical between classical and prototypal inheritance? But because it is such a common question, you might have read about it when prepared for a job interview, or maybe it was taught to you at a bootcamp. Typically, though, the answer gives me a quite shallow and glows over a lot of the detail. This is unfortunately since the box model is a critical part of the CSS rendering. Over the few lessons, we'll go a bit deeper and learn about how the browsers use the box model to dictate layout here. So the box model is critical. The box model is a critical part of CSS rendering. It's a critical part of the CSS rendering model. Over the next few lessons, we'll go a bit deeper and learn about how the browsers use the box model to dictate layouts. Winter layouts. The four aspects that make the box models are this. So winter layers. Winter layers. Okay, I really love that analogy. Winter layers. The four aspects that make up the box model are the four aspects that make up the model are the padding, padding, margin, content, and border. So that's the anatomy of this. The anatomy is this. A helpful analogy is to imagine a person out of the winter walk wearing a big poofy coat. The content is the person itself, the human being inside of the coat. The padding is the polyester stuffing in the coat. The more stuffing there is, the more poof off the coat will be, and the more space the person will take up. The border is the material of the coat. It has a thickness and a color, and it is affect the person's appearance. And the margin is the person's personal space, as we learned in recent years. It is good to have 2 meters, 6 feet of space around us. What? Who told you that, bro? Who told you that? It is a personal space. As we learned in recent years, it is good to have 2 meters, 6 feet to space around. Who told you? Anyway, continue. Debugging in the browser.
So we've talked a little bit about the box model in terms of kind of the abstract pieces and how they relate to each other, but I thought it would be useful if we show how you can actually diagnose real-world problems or get to know how these things come into play when actually building something. So here I have the exact article we're looking at, and I'm going to pop open the DevTools. And maybe the most useful single thing in these DevTools, other than maybe the console, is this little button right here. Select an element in the page. When you click on this button, you get this special cursor, and it allows you to mouse over every element on the page, and it'll tell you a little bit about its box and the box model stuff that we've been talking about. So for example, this ordered list that I just clicked on, you'll notice that there's a blue box, and the blue box represents the content, but there's also an orange box. And you may not know what that is, but it gives you a legend. There's a legend built into the DevTools, and to see it, you have to scroll through all of this stuff until down here you have this box model visualization. And we're looking at this in Chrome. Pretty sure it's almost identical in just about every browser. And the idea is, this is specific to the element I have selected, so if I click on another element, I get a different box. And it shows you the content size, the padding size in green, the border in yellow, and the margin in orange. And I recognize that the color differences between these two are very subtle, but that's why you can just mouse over them and it'll highlight it in turn. So, like if, for example, we're not sure why this number 4 down here has so much distance from the paragraph below, well, the way that I would diagnose that is I would select the number 4, or just kind of click on an element in this vicinity, and then move through the tree and see which element is responsible for it. So at this level, the list item, it doesn't have any margin or border or padding or any reason that there should be this distance, so I'm going to keep going up the tree until you hit the OL, the ordered list. And now you see that there is this visualization of the actual space. You might think that it might be on the paragraph, so you could check that too, but aha, the paragraph only has bottom margin. This is useful for the box model stuff that we're talking about, but it'll continue to be useful throughout the course. So I strongly encourage that if you ever hit a point where you're not sure why something is rendering the way that it is, or you're not sure what's going on, pop open the DevTools and take a look, and I guarantee that more often than not, it will provide context that is helpful for you.
Mm-hmm. So the wind layers. Okay. The wind layers. A helpful analogy. So a helpful analogy is to imagine a person out of winter. Okay. A helpful analogy is to imagine a person out of winter, for a winter walk, wearing a big poofy coat, right? So the content is the person in it itself. Is the person is the human being inside of that. So the content is the person inside of the coat. All right. The padding, exactly, because it's the content, the padding, the border and the margin. Okay, I'll prefer to go with this. The content, the padding, border and the margin. Okay, so the padding is the polyester wool that is inside the coat. The more you have, the more poof up. Interesting. The more poof up. What the fuck? Homosexual. The fuck is this? A less commonly poof. What? Homosexual. What? The more poof of. Poof. An extremely offensive word for a gay man. Poof. What? But this is not improved? What? Poofy. Okay. Poofy. Poofy. Not goofy, poof. But it's interesting is that the more poofy, poofy, poofy hair or clothes. American English with poofy sleeve. Exactly, poofy hair or clothes. Look big and soft and filled with air. She wore a poofy blonde wig. Blonde wig. Poofy in Spanish, como esponjoso. Not goofy is poofy. Poofy, poofy, poofy. Oh my god. Poofy in Spanish. Exacto, esponjoso, hinchado, abultado, mullido. Exacto, como, ok, esponjoso, poofy. Okay. The more poof up, abultado. The more poof up. Exactly. The more poof up. Okay. The more poof up the code. Exactly. The more poof up the code. The more poof up the code will be. Will be. Exactly. So the more space the person will take. So the more space a person will take. The other is the border is the thick material is the thick superficial material of the coat. Alright, is the material of the coat, or exactly is the okay is the thick material of the coat, the border. Okay, is the thick material of the coat. In the margin. In the margin. Is the person's personal space. Is the person space. Personal space. Is the person personal space. I don't know who. Well, this is from Canada. What do you expect? Well, anyway. As we learned in recent years, it is good to have 2 meters or 6 feet of space around. So it is good to have 2 meters or 6 feet around. So yeah, but the legend of the box model is like this image, bro. So you have now Let me actually is doing this. Box sizing. Interesting. It's not loading. Computed. What about this? Style. Computed. Oh, there you got it. Exactly. It seems that they're using now a grid. So for example here, I know that this might be quite silly, but it's to understand and it's to create a story here of why we're doing the kind of stuff, and now have a mental model, have this understanding, man. Is this understanding? Is the understanding? Is the understanding? So keep looking at this, all right? Keep moving. When we say that an element should have a width of 1000 or of 100, what does it actually mean? This is box sizing. Exactly. And this is now box sizing. All right. And that's a good question. So when we say that an element should have a width of 100%, what does that actually mean? What does that actually mean? You know? It turns out the browser might have a slightly different interpretation that you do. It seems the browser might have a slightly different interpretation. It seems the browser might have a slightly different interpretation of what that means. So the aspect affects the size of the elements. So the code snippet below will draw a black rectangle on the screen. Due to the border, what are the dimensions of the rectangle? So if we say, hey, section, the section is 500 pixels, all right? And then you say, so the width of this will be 500 pixels. That's interesting. That include is, what I'm assuming that include is the content padding, border, and margin. All right, 500 pixels, right? And the border here class this say, hey, take all the available space, right? And then let's go to now add some padding here. Interesting. And let's now go add to some padding here. All right. So the width, what does the width mean? That's a good question. That's a very good question. Width and padding and border. So does the width mean is the content plus the padding? All right. Does it mean count is the counting on the padding? All right. Because if you do something like this, you say, hey, the entire content of this. Okay, I think you say, hey, this box that has 500 pixels, this is the maximum width that I can have. So you figuring out somehow how you can take now 20% padding there. Okay. Let me actually put this. Actually put that a test. So I say here, right? Say this one. You are saying is, hey, the width here will be is, let's say, 100 pixels. Okay. So this will be the width. 100 pixels. Okay. So this is the width. We're gonna put it here like 500. 500. Okay. Now, because this is the maximum width, all right, that this element will have. Okay. Because this is the maximum element that this have. Anything that now say, hey, let me take is the width of 100 of the padding container, all right? And if I add some padding here, because I added some, and if I add some padding here, I say is, I'm going to also is box sizing. So figuring out how to compute is this. So this padding here that I'm gonna attach is 20 pixels in any direction, but I'm not going to take additional space from the content. So what it's gonna do is to compute here is the dimension, all right, in which I am, to actually take that available space for you. And similar for the border. If I say border 4 pixels solid, it will say that. But again, it doesn't take more than the available space that was defined. Okay, the box model says that. So in your mind, what it's doing is say, hey, this is the maximum width, all right? The maximum width of this will be 500, and if this element is now going to take whatever width is on the pattern and apply some padding and margins, it will be inside of this width, right? So it will be like this. It would take, it'll be is 500 pixels. Oh, so the width, so the height is modified, but the width not. Okay, that's interesting. So the width is modifying, so the width remains, but the height modifying is you don't specify that. When we set the dot box to have width 100%, we're saying that the box content side should be equal to the available space, which is 500 pixels. The padding and the border is adding on the top. Our boxes will up being 548 wide because it adds 20% pixels and padding and 4% border to each size. but okay, it also modifying is that the same things happens with height because the element is empty. It has a content size of 0 pixels with the same border and padding added to the top. This behavior is surprising and generally not what we want as a developer. Thankfully, browsers provide an escape hatch. The box sizing CSS property allows us to change the rule for size calculation. The default value is content box, only takes the inner content into account, but it offers an alternative value border box. With box sizing border box, things behave much more intuitive. Okay. Okay. Okay, but it's because it's the content. By default. Exactly, because browser don't wants to okay. Check out the following code. So what the answer is quite shocking because it is 500 500 because it is 480 pixels on the both sides and the 48 pixels in height, you know, width. So what is the width and height of the following code? What is the width and the height of the following snippet? The answer is quite shocking because it is width 408 and height 480 pixels. Since browsers by default take the box model, okay, as the content. So the default value of box sizing is the content, which is not intuitive. Intuitive. All right. So we can set the box sizing to border, which make things much more predictable and intuitive. Exactly. So with box size and border box, things behave much more intuitive. To border box. Box size into border box. So box size into border box, and again is to gain return. Okay, and to gain return compatibility. That's why we say, hey, you know what?
All right, so if you got that multiple choice question wrong, there is nothing to be embarrassed about.
No, not at all. In fact, I recognize what is my flaw here. I recognize what my flaw was. And he's like, oh, I don't know how the things work, that's all. I don't know how the things work, yet I want to know how that works. Okay. Now let me do this. Okay.
It is in fact very surprising that the browser behaves the way that it does. We're going to try and change how that browser behaves so that it aligns more closely with our expectations. So here we have another example. We have the text hello world, which is sitting inside a paragraph, and that paragraph is sitting within a section. And if we look at our styles, the section has a constrained width of 150 pixels, but if we investigate this with the browser DevTools, you'll notice our paragraph is taking up 186 pixels. And as we just saw, the reason for that is that by setting width to be 100%, we are saying that the content size should be 150 pixels. Right?
We are saying that the content height should be 100% fit. Exactly. What in this case we're saying is that the content size. So here, so in the example above, we are saying that section we are saying that okay. So in the example above, we are saying that section must be so section height must exactly so section height must be 500 pixel, but the content, okay, the content in the box model, all right, and that box, the class box dot boss is gonna, so the content dot box, their content width will be 100%, which means the 500 pixels from the parent, okay, plus 20% pixels on top is at the plus 20% pixels on all directions for padding and 4 pixels on any direction and plus 4 pixels of any directions for border. So that's the story here.
the size of this blue box, the inner blue box inside the green box.
Exactly.
This is going to be 100% of the parent, and then it adds the padding and the border on top of that. So we wind up being 36 pixels wider than intended, because we have 16 pixels on each side for padding and 2 pixels on each side for border. The way to fix this is to toggle on a property called box sizing and to set it to be border box. So by default, this value is content box, and content box is the way that we've just seen. Essentially, when you use a percentage width, it sets that percentage based on the content size, not the size of the box contained by the border. So one thing that's kind of cool that the DevTools let you do, you'll notice I have this commented out line of CSS. And when you leave a line of CSS in, but commented out, it does show up in the DevTools. So rather than having to write this in myself, I can just take a little box and it enables that property. So just a little trick, whenever you're writing code, if you want to be able to toggle something, just comment it out and then you can use this in the DevTools. But you'll notice when I toggle this box on and off, the behavior changes, right? This box shrinks. And now with this property on, when I investigate it, my paragraph actually is 150 pixels now. And the way that it does that is it essentially includes the padding and the border as part of the width calculation. So before, my blue box was 150 pixels wide. Now it's much smaller. It looks like 116 or so. So by shrinking the size of that blue box, we're able to make sure that everything can fit within the width that we've established. And this generally aligns much better with how you think, because the alternative is having to figure out, what percentage do I need this to be in order for it to be 100% of this, but then minus the size that I need for this. It's just generally easier, right? We tend to think of boxes as being defined by their borders. So I think to make our lives much easier, for the rest of the course, you can assume that this property is enabled, because this is how I always write CSS. I always have this property on. And in the very next section, you'll see how to enable that globally so that you never have to think about this again.
Using the CSS resets. Using the CSS reset, a new default. Instead of having to remember to swap boxing on every layout element, we can set it as a default value for all elements with this CSS snippet. Right? So this might be a tip. I will say productivity tip. What the French does? Exactly. You can comment some declarations and toggle it in your web browser for convenience. Alright. And then you have is this one. Instead of having to remember all of this, this is the very first rule in the custom CSS, and arguably the most important. Everything is just much more intuitive with the box sizing model. Why the pseudo elements? You may wonder, why do we need to add the elements and after? Shouldn't the wildcard select everything? Well, yes and no. The selector will select all elements, but before and after aren't considered elements. The pseudo elements also so we need to select them explicitly. A new default, for example, like this. And this is a common way And this is a common way of this CSS reset. This is the most important CSS reset we need to have in our arsenal. And why we pseudo select like this? So you may expect it. No. No, does not. It doesn't select that. Okay. The box model. The TLDR of this section is to say, recognize what is the CSS, what is the box model, which describe how CSS visually represent HTML in as a box, and the anatomy of this box, that you can think of this like a winter layers. So if a person go out and do a winter walk, all right, and you see them, that the content is the person in itself inside of the coat, the padding is the fluffy stuff that is made of the wool, the polyester. So the more polyester you have, or any other this material, the more proof of the person will look like, the more space it will take. Okay. And the border is the material of the coat, all right, as well as the well, this actually turns out to be very great. This coat, by the way, in the winter. And the border is that, and the margin is the personal space that people must have. Accordingly to them, is like 2 meters, and to me that's quite interesting because they are from Canada anyway. So the idea is that when you want to compute what the width represents, okay, and I think this is a very common interview question, that the width represent is now traditionally the content of that element, which is actually counterintuitive, because most of the time when we look at something, a specific box, we including is their width with their border, right? The entire element here. But because browser has now by default is this way to measure width via the content, all right? Any additional padding and border is going to modify is the width beyond that, right? It's gonna only count is the content front. So it's a way to fix this issue that is not intuitive for ourselves, to figuring out what is the particularly dimension or width of this element. So we say that, hey, I want to get from all of the elements, including the pseudo elements, you have to be explicitly because it doesn't include that, including the pseudo elements, that all of them, the box model, the width of that box model, it'll start from the border, right? So that's interesting. It's very, very interesting. You can take a look now at the CSS border box sizing. All right. You can say content box or border box, you know. It also includes the padding inside of that, which is way much more convenient. And if you say now suddenly margin in any direction of 5 pixels, it actually look at this. Exactly. The content now the content now, or the width of this content is no longer is what we might expect. So in other words, we can say is this has to be 100 pixel, you know. All right. And then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5, and as you can see, is now so the width of this element, it must be is 110 element, 110. And if you take a look at this, because the width is now counted here, the entire dimension of this element is 100. Oh, it includes also the margin, really? It includes that. But the available space that you're gonna take, it also includes the margin. Interesting. It also includes the margin. It also includes the margin. It also includes the margin. That's quite interesting. No, it doesn't include the margin. Exactly. It doesn't include the margin. So the width of that element might be is 100 or 100 pixel, but the reality is that the margin is not taken in consideration here. You know, this is 70, 5 and 5, and if you add this, it gives you now 100, but there's now additional margin here that is not taken into consideration during the computation. So things works the way it is, right? Padding border and margin. Okay. A helpful way to think about padding is that it is the inner space. Wait, what? Okay. Is that the inner space of this? Yeah, exactly. Is that the inner space of this? Now let's take a look at this. A helpful way to think about padding is that it is inner space. Imagine you add a background color to an element with some padding here. So some fella, and you're adding the padding here. Because padding is on the inside, the padded area also receives the background color. Exactly. So padding can be set for all directions at once, and it can be specified for individual direction. Here we're using is the padding top with the physical dimensions, and the other is the logical properties, which is not which follow is the direction, not the physical direction. It follow is the logical direction. The same thing, but using logical properties. Asymmetric, logical, and padding. Padding block star and block n, and inline star and padding inline n. Okay. So we got now is this, the padding, the units, and the percentage. And the shorthand properties. A way to remember that is a clockwise. overriding values. Okay. Exactly. And then you have the unit. So here we were looking at the padding here. So padding here. Exactly, padding. A helpful way to think about padding is that it is inner space. Imagine that you add a background color to an element with some padding. Like this. So the padding is the inner space. So the padding is the inner space. Okay? Chill, man. Is the inner space. So imagine that you add now a background color here. And of course this goal to produce is this one. Right? So if you imagine is this particular box, so imagine, so from the following snippet, okay, we create is this rectangle. Exactly. So padding can be set for all directions at once, and it can be specified for individual direction. So padding can be so padding can be set for all directions. Padding can be set for all directions at once. Or it can be specified for individual direction, or it can be specified for individual directions. So for example, the most common one, which is even padding, right? You can say, hey, even padding, or we can say it's a traditional asymmetric padding, or the same thing but using logical properties here. The thing here by using logical property. If I look at this and then I say instead of doing this, say is padding, instead of doing padding top, I will say padding block top. Exactly, padding block top 20 pixel. All right, padding block down 20 pixel. And if you talk about this blocks, remember blocks, it is perpendicular to the flow of the text. So you got now things like this, block top and block down, I'm assuming is that, or block star. Okay, so block star and block N. So in other words, is the left block star and block N. Okay, and then you have now padding inline star. Okay, padding inline star. Exactly, is left. Padding inline star. And padding inline star N of the 80 pixels. That's quite interesting. Very, very interesting. So block star and block end, and then now inline N, inline star, and inline N. Oh, okay. Holy fuck. The units. So the units can be used. This is padding. Okay. Yeah, this is padding, this is unit. Okay. Exactly. Inside of this, well, the root M, and percentage. Pixel M and root M. Oh, exactly. And this. Many developers believe that pixels are bad for accessibility. This is true when it comes to font size, but I actually think pixels are the best unit to use for padding. Okay. For accessibility, pixels are bad. Pixels are bad for it, except for padding. For accessibility, pixels are bad for it except for padding.
So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the different units we can use with padding and go through the trade-offs and talk about which is better and which is worse in different situations. And first I want to talk about the M unit. I think that this is one of the more common units people use. The idea is that the padding will now be relative to the font size. So in this case we have a header, which has a font size of 2 rem, that's this text over here. And because the font size is twice as big as the default of 1 rem, we have twice as much padding. And in general, this isn't really what I want, right? Like what I would prefer is to have a nice solid line where all of the text lines up on the same thing, because all the containers have like a shared system for units, right? So I have a spacing system, and I decide that I want 32 pixels of side spacing, and everywhere should do that. So I'm going to change this to 32 pixels, and I'm going to do the same thing down here. And now I have this nice, very clear vertical line that they both just use because they're using the same system. Now, a lot of people think that the pixel unit is inaccessible, and that is absolutely true if you use it in the font size, or at least it's mostly true. I did discuss this in Module 0. When it comes to padding, though, I would actually argue that the pixel unit is the more accessible than rem. And let's unpack that a little bit, because I think it's important. There's 2 ways I can affect the size of elements on the page. The first is I can use zooming. So if I hold Command and do the plus sign, it's probably Control plus on Windows, everything gets bigger. And this is true regardless of unit, right? You'll notice I have 32 pixels, but as I zoom, the padding is actually increasing. And if I make it really small, we can really see that it really is like looking at something under a magnifying glass, right? Everything is scaling consistently. That's one of two ways I can control the font size. The other way is if I go into the Chrome settings and go down to Appearance, I have this drop down where I can choose font size, and I can go even further and have like a slider where I can really pick the exact size that I want. We're going to stick with these just to keep things simple. So I can set this to be very large, and now the text size has improved, but the difference is that this only affects text size. So I still have 32 pixels of padding. It's still a true 32 pixels. Now you might think, isn't this bad? Like, don't I want the padding to scale with the text? And I would say probably not, at least not in this situation.
Exactly.
If we think about why people do this, right? Why is this an option? Typically it's because people's eyesight isn't as good, so you want to bump up the font size to make it easier to read. And spacing doesn't really have the same requirement, right? Like, as long as the text is big enough, and as long as there is sufficient distance between the text, other than that, I don't really need it to scale. And if I do, I have the browser zooming mechanic I can use. So I like to have the padding of my different containers. That stuff is fixed when it comes to font size, because it really is kind of a usability benefit, right? Because if I do it the other way, if I set this to be 2 rems, well, now you'll notice there's less horizontal space available, right? I've scrunched this up a little bit. What that means is that there's going to be less words per line and ultimately a taller page, both because there's more top-bottom padding, but also because the lines are going to wrap more. And so both of those things kind of seem like a usability minus to me. So I know it's a bit counterintuitive, or at least it's not what you commonly hear, but when it comes to padding, and by extension margin and border as well, I think that pixels are the most accessible unit we can use. For people who really do want to increase the space between elements, they have that option with zooming. And for everyone else, we actually make the product a little bit nicer to use by making sure that the padding stays consistent and the text size is the only thing that scales.
Or using is now a CSS variable for that. Okay. Can I pull this? Can I create a padding for this? Or a pen? Okay. Okay. There you got it. Okay. Gonna create a new band. Accessibility pixels in padding or for padding. Exactly. So no matter how much I scale this, for example, if you say, hey, this will be now a root element, all right, or one root element, and if I scale this, the more I scale this, it's actually still consistent, right? Because if you set that to a m, so in other words, is a TLDR of that is that be consistent on so be consistent on that, and the page becomes larger and larger and larger. So that's a case here. But because right now we can use is now root m for that, that will be no a problem. Making a case for y pixels is good only in padding. Okay. Padding percentage. Can we use percentage for padding like this? We can, but the result is surprisingly counterintuitive. Percentage are always calculated based on the elements available with. Okay. Percentage. Padding percentage. Percentage. Case. Padding percentage case. Okay. Yes, we can use it, but since percentage is calculated are always percentage are always calculated based on the width, all right, based on the elements available with, based on the element available with, and this is important, okay, yes, we can use it, but since percentages are always calculated based on the elements in the elements with, or in the elements available with. Okay, this is true for left and right padding, and even for top and bottom padding. But again, based on the elements here. Try resizing the result tab and notice how exactly. Let me actually make the case for padding percentages. Accessibility for padding in percentage. You need caution. So here we got another thin box percentage. We put now a box percentage. All right, into this. So if you take a look at this, so the padding here for this box percentage is say I'm gonna take all the available space, all the available element width here, which is from all of this I'm gonna take now a quarter, which is something like this, of its padding, from left to right, or in other words, from, as a way to get myself familiar with, padding from block start, exactly, padding for block start and block end. So block start and block end, and inline start and inline end. Okay, that is something, bro. That is something. That is something. So if we inspect this element here, all right, we say that it's gonna take is the 20% of the padding here. So the box in here is now being calculated based on that. It's being calculated, so it takes all the available space, all right, which is the width of that, including is the content and the border, all right, and it's gonna say, hey, the padding will be is a quarter of this in any dimension, or in this case it's only the top direct dimension, exactly, only on the top, only on the top. And if you divide that, say calculator 3054 divide by 4, is give you that as it is. Okay, exactly. But again, it's gonna take is so the percentage is calculated based on the element available, based on the current element available space. And then we have now the shorthand properties. Well, the shorthand property is something that I'm quite familiar with, right? Shorthand properties. So you got is this, for example. And how the easiest way. So the easiest way to remember it is by as via the clockwise. All right. So the easy way to remember it is via clockwise. How are you going to apply that? So top right, left bottom. And beyond padding. This padding is shared among other CSS properties that have shorthand value. For example, margin and border style. Border radius. A similar padding is used for the properties that affect corners. like border radius, top left, and the follow is this consistency. Beyond padding and overriding values. Shorthand. This game asks you to decode a padding property to assign a number of each of the 4 cardinal directions. This game asks you to decode padding is okay. And to decode that. So we could do this in our shorthand property like box like this. And then you can override, okay, overriding values. Overriding values. So let's say we want to produce is this. So let's say we want to produce this, right? So we can either doing this via shorthand property, doing this. You say top right, bottom, and the other is 48 as well. Or another which is more clear, to read, which is this. Apply all the borders and then that particular direction, set to 0. Long form property can override the relevant value in shorthand property. This is also part of the CSS cascade rule. How competing styles, how browsers solve competing CSS declarations. How browsers solve CSS competing declarations, bro. So in this long form property can override the relevant value in the shorthand property. The effect is the same, but it's a bit more semantic. Instead of random string of numbers, we are declaring that we want 48 padding and hold the bottom. Please note the order matters. Exactly, the order matter here is because, remember, of the CSS cascading style. This is why look at the CSS cascading style is important and is relevant here. Is important and is relevant. So you don't have to make this declaration here because you already know what the CSS is all about. Note. In question 1, work out the padding for each of the 4 slides. So you say top, right, down, left, and I really love about the accessibility that I provide here. You say top and down, bottom right, right? So it'd say top and down, top and right 0, down 40 and left 0. And here you're saying is top and right, whereas down is this, and here is 0. Your answer is 20, 40, 10, and 0. But we're looking at 20, 20, 40. Oh, and it's applied to that? Interesting. Both vertical and direction are provide 20 and 10 exactly. Top, right, down, but only one horizontal direction is provided. When this happens, the right side is copied to the left side, similar to this. So when this happens, this actually copy the same to the other for that. Okay, so here you're saying is top and down. Okay. Okay. Top and down will be 0. Alright. And then the other rights will be 30. But top will be 40. And then this will be now is like this. The other is padding block and inline block. You say padding block, which both of them are this. Padding block and inline block is this. And then the padding inline is 10, but I want that the where is star, in our case, is left to right, is 0, and the other is now 10. Exactly. And then you have question 6. Work out the padding for each of the 4 slides. Give the following snippet. Padding left is 30, and in all directions is 0. So it end up evaluating is the last one, that is 0. That was quite interesting, by the way. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.